Our day 2, Strand 1 talk is by Dirk Lagerwaard. Dr. Hendrik Dirk Lagerwaard holds a summa cum laude doctoral degree from Pompeu Fabra University in Spain. He teaches English at a secondary school and is an associate professor on the MA in Teacher Training for Secondary Education and Baccalaureate, Professional Training and Language Learning at the Blanquerna Ramon Llull University in Spain. During Dirk's session, we recommend watching in speaker view. Over to you. Please share your screen, Dirk.
Elizabeth, thank you very much for the introduction, and hello everybody. It's good to see so many people already interacting at the chat. Let's see if I can share my PowerPoint presentation with you. And at the same time, let me see if I can also open up my chat box so I can see all your comments. I think I'm actually achieving it, so that is fantastic news. Can you let me know if you can all see the PowerPoint clearly in the group? Just a quick feedback from all of you. Wonderful. Okay, thank you. By your comments, I can also see that you can hear me clearly. So thank you very much. And in case you have any questions regarding what I will be explaining today, feel free to write them down in the chat box, but I will address all of them at the end of this talk. That being said, as you can already see in the title, I will be discussing the implementation of agency-based approaches in secondary English language education. So with no further ado, let me explain what it is that you can exactly expect from this talk. I'll start off by explaining the relevance of the main concept of this presentation, which is agency. After that, I will briefly explain what learner agency implies, and from there, I will provide a conceptual basis for agency-based approaches. Now, the good thing is that based on these conceptual bases, I will further develop and provide pedagogical principles for agency-based approaches, which you can use as teachers or materials writers in order to develop your own agency-based approaches or your own agency-based practical applications. In order to make the understanding easier, I will give you two examples. The first one being the implementation of teaching learning sequences, and after that I will explain the importance of creating a trusting learning environment. What these two have in common is that they both promote the use of the language that the learners are learning from their agency in a volitional way. But I'll get back to that later on, and I'll wrap up with the conclusions. As you can see, part of it will be pretty theoretical, but in the end, my aim is to bridge the gap between research and the foreign language classroom, or in this case, the secondary classroom, which is where you can find me from Monday to Friday every week. There we go. The relevance of agency. Now, agency is a very widely discussed topic, and it is often mentioned, like, for example, in the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, where it is even included in the main objectives. As the framework states, there should be an empowering vision of the learner as a social agent, acting in the social world and exerting agency in the learning process. Now, even though agency is given this huge importance, it is curiously that within this framework from 2020 and the companion volume from 2018, that agency is not further explained, it's not described, it's even not explained how exactly we can include this in our classroom. So this is kind of strange, so to say. At the same time, when it comes to research, many authors nowadays, especially when it comes to primary language education, such as Alice and Ibrahim, they also discuss agency, but also Stetsenko points out that there is this task of education to offer lessons that include agency, so that students can develop their own agency within the language that they are learning. And they should be included and involved in activities where they have the opportunity to express themselves in their own unique way. That is to say, through their agency. But at the same time, research, the Common European Framework of Reference, they do not explain what agency is and how this can be achieved. Therefore, I discovered, or I tried to study this in my doctoral study, and I'm really excited to share with you everything that I have learned along the way. But in order to create these agency-based approaches, we first need to understand what exactly learner agency is. Now, like I said before, it is often described in relation to many other aspects, but my aim for now is to explain what learner agency is, and in order to avoid any misunderstandings, I will also discuss some confusions about the topic in itself. First of all, agency is often confused with autonomy. However, there's a big difference between autonomy and agency, as autonomy is the enhancing factor of agency. How learners decide to express themselves depends on whether they have the autonomy to do so. Agency is how you, as a language learner, take advantage of this autonomy and look for ways to express yourself in your own way. Then, agency is often confused with willingness to communicate. However, our decision to deliberately not say anything in the language is also a sign of our unique way of being and therefore of our own agency. So, what exactly is agency then? Well, the most widely described way of agency is, and most used, is to see agency as the social culturally mediated capacity to act, according to Van Leer, which basically means that our social relationships and the culture in which we find ourselves determine how we express ourselves in the foreign language. Now, Sarah Mercer agrees with this, that there's this influence of our social relationships and the culture, but at the same time, she mentions that agency goes further than that and describes it as self-regulated activity, meaning that our actions are not only involved they are not only being influenced by the social relationships and the culture, but at the same time by the emotions that we experience, by the belief we have in ourselves to make the difference when speaking in a foreign language, our motives, and of course what we know about the foreign language and its use in context. This therefore also implies, like Lentov and Thorne explain, that agency also includes assigning significance and relevance to aspects, because that is what triggers our behavior, our way of expressing our agency. Summarizing all this, what we can get to is a definition of agency, which I recommend you to hold on to, which is seeing agency as the capacity to consciously make your own emotionally influenced decisions on how to express yourself in your own unique way in relevant contexts. Let me explain what exactly I mean by this. If we take, for example, this square, and we see it as the foreign language classroom, where we have lots of different students involved, a classroom or another relevant context. It is important to say that even though we are all involved in the same situation, how each and every single student interprets what is going on and how they experience this is unique for every single individual. This emotional experience is of crucial importance because it is what triggers our behavior. But before we act, we self-regulate our activity. That is to say, before expressing what we have in mind, we depend on our knowledge of the foreign language, not only about the language, but also it's our knowledge about the event, the communicative event in which we find ourselves or the context. And it is also influenced by our emotions, which are triggered from the context, and our belief in ourselves. After this regulation process, secondary students end up expressing themselves. But in comparison to primary students, secondary students really start to develop this capacity to reflect, not only on the language, but also on their behavior. And so this is what agency is all about. It is not the action in itself in the foreign language, not only the action, but also the regulation process that lies behind the action. So agency, therefore, could be summarized as a self-regulated activity. This being said, what could be the conceptual basis to develop this? Well, I recommend you to follow the social cultural theory from Lev Vygotsky. Now, what exactly did Vygotsky say? Well, he stated that all the students together are stronger than each and every single individual on its own in the classroom. And if we help each other and interact with each other, then we create a zone of proximal development where we can mediate with one another. That is to say, we can discuss knowledge about the foreign language in order to create our own idea of how the language works. If we are involved as secondary learners with our own ideas of how the language works, and we are being questioned about whether some things are to be said in this way or the other, we create our own idea of how the language works. And therefore, instead of explaining as the teacher, what you try to do is guide the interaction in the classroom and let students create the knowledge together so that it sticks to them. By letting them being involved with their own thoughts in this interaction, they create their own cognitive tools, which is what they will use to express themselves in the way that they would like to. That is, through their own agency. And by practicing, what takes place is internalization. That is, only by means of how we use the language can teachers see whether students have really understood how to use it in their own unique way. Now, this sociocultural theory is further developed by Stetsenko, who says that this interaction and the preparation towards this interaction is so important that we need to prepare students with the option to develop their agency, but at the same time be included in activities where they can use the language through their agency, and this way develop it in the foreign language. However, as this teaching approach is created by Stetsenko, or this metaphor, this contribution metaphor for a wide variety of teaching activities, I have included 5 more aspects in order to relate it more to English language teaching. First and foremost, instead of only explaining, so to say, knowledge about the language and how the language works, it's important for students to become aware of not only how the language works, but also how to use it in their own unique way. That is what is meant by language as a social practice perspective. Apart from that, students need to be involved with their own thoughts in the learning process to figure out how the language works, and this way reconstruct their own idea of how the language works, because this is what they will use when being involved in communicative activities. In these communicative activities, they need to have the opportunity to take a stance and stand up for themselves and use their own voice to express what they have in mind. But if we really want to achieve this in the classroom, then we also need to look for ways in which students can feel comfortable enough to express themselves. Therefore, an environment of trust needs to be created for students to feel confident enough to dare and express themselves without having to fear of what the negative consequences could be. Last but not least, a recommendation by Alice and Ibrahim, which is that the structure, therefore, in the classroom is important, but opportunities need to be provided for students to be autonomous, because only through autonomy can students express themselves through their agency and learn from it. So based on this conceptual metaphor of the sociocultural theory and the contribution metaphor in order to let students dare to express themselves, let's have a look at the pedagogical principles. Now, the pedagogical principles, in my opinion, to foster agency in your classroom are 5, with autonomy being the enhancing concept of the entire approach to let students develop their agency and their capacity to express themselves through it. Let me briefly explain the first 3. Creative reconstruction being the opportunity that you can provide as teachers in the classroom to let students get involved with their own thoughts about how the language works in individual work, pair work, group work, so they can readjust their ideas and get a better idea of how the language works so they can use it on their terms. Second aspect, dialogic pedagogy, which is an outstanding book written by Alexander on how to mediate conversation in the classroom or dialogue in the conversation in order to enable students to create the knowledge and help them whenever necessary, but build up the knowledge together instead of the teacher explaining only the knowledge about the language and its use. And last but not least, affordances. If you allow students to express themselves from their own agency, that is, express themselves the way they are as human beings, then obviously doubts will come up and questions will arise which need to be addressed. These are affordances, and these also need to be anticipated in order to provide meaningful learning in the classroom. Now, I have not yet mentioned reflective action-oriented learning and the emotional dimension, because I will discuss these two in the practical applications I will discuss shortly after this. Now, these principles, they can appear together or separately, but they all have their own function in order to either develop agency or to let them develop their knowledge about the language so they can express themselves better in their own unique way, which is the communicative development of the learners. Now, you can see in the graph different percentages with the biggest outstanding principles, the emotional dimension and reflective action-oriented learning. And this is because these are the two that enable students over the course, little by little, to more voluntarily express themselves through their agency, to let them take the initiative and fearlessly express themselves. But it must be said that this is a process. Let me explain how these two principles can be put into practice. So there we go. The first practical application would be reflective action-oriented learning, and I have created, based on this, implementing teaching learning sequences, which consists of a sequence of tasks in order to communicatively and cognitively orient the students so that they can be confident enough to know in which context they find themselves, and to enable them to express themselves not only through their agency, but also anticipate the other person's reaction through agency. What I have done with my students was prepare them for a Skype interaction with my brother who lives in Denmark. But this activity can be a preparation for all kinds of communicative activities, being it a Zoom interaction with an exchange project with another school, or WhatsApp conversations, or informal conversations with a friend, or job interviews, anything. Therefore, let me explain what these steps are so you can make them your own and maybe implement them in your classroom. So what I first do with my students is I try to orient them communicatively first. So in class, we discuss first the context in itself, which in this case is the Zoom interaction with my brother in Denmark. And they had the opportunity to ask him 2 questions, each one of the students. And so individually, in groups or pairs, you can choose, you let them reflect on what the most likely steps are for such an interaction. By doing so, what is being achieved is that they start to orient themselves within the context. And later, after these reflections, we bring them together in open class feedback, and we design together the most likely steps that are to take place. This goes from greeting the brother to asking how he is doing, introducing the questions, asking the questions, thanking for the answers, and saying goodbye. Now, after that, I go to personally orienting the students in the second column, where students write down how they would carry out these steps in their own unique way, had it been in their own language. Let me explain why I do this. I do this because if we did this immediately in English, students are very likely to come up with very typical sentences like, hello, how are you? But what if they would like to express themselves in a different way, a more informal way, or a way that is closely related to their agency? Like in Spanish could be, for example, ¿Qué pasa? ¿Cómo estamos? Which is, what's up? How are we doing today? And so what we do is enabling students by means of the second column to find their own way, their own voice in the foreign language. So what they learn is really closely related to their own agency. And so they develop after the steps. They write down in their own way what they would do for each and every single step. And afterwards, they look for the equivalent in the English language. So after orienting the students communicatively and later on cognitively, I look for ways to look for ways in which we can improve. So I correct, I look for the common mistakes, and in class I look for a interactive and fun way in order to deal with these mistakes. After dealing with this, I let students together create with me the evaluation criteria. So they think about what is important when it comes to interacting in such a context, and then we write down these evaluation criteria, which can be very basic, like the use of grammar or vocabulary, but they learn how to take different aspects in consideration as well, such as the intonation or the tone of voice or anticipating what the other person says. And so after this, that's when I let them interact in role plays with one another. So they both have the opportunity to be the person from the preparation and the other person to act like my brother in this case. The good thing is, even the shy students who express themselves, they can follow this guideline as a script. However, the good thing is that they may control what they are saying, but they cannot control what the other person will say. And so they will have to anticipate comments and questions from the other person. And these moments are crucial, these moments of anticipating, because that's where students will have to start improvising. And by means of improvising, they can become aware that they are actually able to express themselves in the foreign language. And so it changes their belief system. And the more the students start to believe in themselves, the more likely it is for them to express themselves more volitionally over the course. At least that is what my doctoral study showed. So the more you implement these sequences and the more opportunities they have to anticipate, the more students will become aware that they are able to do it. And this is further encouraged when they carry out the real life interaction, in this case with my brother. And so they became aware that they were also able to do this with people who did not speak the same language as they did. And so it was a very empowering process over the course. And after each and every single communicative event, I would sit down with the students and evaluate each one of them with the evaluation criteria. And so would they. Now let me explain the importance of this evaluation. But before I do so, what I would like to say is that the second crucial practical implementation to foster or promote agency is to create a trusting learning environment. Because the more trust the learners experience in the classroom, the more likely it is for them to open up and to express themselves in the way they would like to without being afraid of what the teacher may say or being laughed at or any other problems related to stress or anxiety, frustration, anger. So we need to create a trusting learning environment. You are familiar with different ways to do so. Let me describe 2 ways in which you can achieve this in your own classroom. One can be done by means of providing descriptive feedback. This is closely related to an outstanding plenary given, I believe, last year from Carol Reed on praise, where she explains that it is not only about the evaluative feedback of saying, good job, well done. It's all about explaining why they did such a good job and, if possible, providing examples. So be concrete, go to the point and show them, and that's why I like this image so much. By doing so, what you do with the learner is you let them have a look at themselves, but from different points of view. So they learn about their strengths, but also on what is not there yet. And that's what I like so much about this descriptive feedback, is that it makes the students aware of who they are, what their strengths are, and what is not yet there, which is a different point of view from stating what is not there. Because this way of evaluating creates growth mindsets. It points out the strengths and it shows what is not yet there but can be worked on along the course. So students learn about themselves and how to develop along the way. By showing that we care about the students and their development, we also create a bond of trust with the students because they understand that they are being cared for. Another aspect would be the emotional dimension, to be precise, anticipating negative emotions. Not negative emotions from the students, which is well discussed in research, but anticipating our own negative emotions as teachers. Sometimes situations in the secondary classroom can be nerve-wracking and can make you feel angry and make you wanna, well, those of you who teach, you know. Instead of immediately transmitting this anger, try to embrace these situations of conflict and open a dialogue with the student. This, preferably, is to be done one-on-one. Listen to the students, recognize their point of view, discuss it, and learn from them and their emotions so you can adapt not only your lessons to the students, but at the same time create trust because they see that they are being cared for and cared of. Now, to summarize this in the conclusions, we've basically discussed what agency is and how to create a conceptual basis for agency-based approaches. I have offered various pedagogical principles for you to either learn from or create your own teaching strategies, but there are several things you can do. You can either use these practical ideas and take them straight with you to the classroom. You can also look at these articles or my dissertation and use these for research purposes, or, which I dare you to do, try to use this information and create your own agency-based approaches so that you can look for ways to not only develop your learners' agency, but also to make them feel empowered. They have their own voice. Let there be teachers who empower them to do so. So maybe you can research your own action in the classroom. That is all for now. I believe these are my 25 minutes. It has been an absolute pleasure. If there are any questions, I'll have a look at the text box or at the chat box right now. If there are any questions, it will be my pleasure to answer to them. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dirk, for the very inspirational talk regarding the importance of a trusting atmosphere for our students in which they can be empowered to learn. That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Shall we wait for any questions, Elizabeth, in the chat box?
Yeah, because we have another couple of minutes that we can wait and see.
My pleasure, everybody. Thank you for all the lovely feedback in the chat box. Thank you so much.
Hi, Dirk. The question in the Q&A box from
the Q&A box, of course.
Yeah.
Yes, here we are. So, how can we develop learners' agency in academic writing classes if we emphasize structured writing and adherence to text type templates? That's from Eden Flores.
Really, really good question. Promoting agency is trying to find your freedom within what is possible, right? So I understand that in the case of academic writing, you are influenced by the rules from such a type of text that you have to write. But it's all about empowering their students to let them have or obtain the tools that allow them to express what they want to say within that text type. So as long as they can say what they want to say within that text type, then you achieve them expressing themselves through their agency. So it's all about finding your personal freedom within the so-called rules of every text or genre type. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. That's the only question at the moment, so we can conclude there. And we're now going to have a 20-minute break.
Okay.
So a 20-minute break. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, everybody. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.